All text that comes from outside of your Python process starts as binary data. When you open a file in Python, the default mode is R, or RT, for read text mode, meaning we'll get back strings that represent text. But that's not what Python actually reads from disk. If we open a file with the mode RB, we'll see what Python sees, which is bytes. Bytes are what Python decodes to make strings. If you have a string in Python and you'd like to convert it into bytes, you can call its encode method. The encode method uses the character encoding UTF-8 by default, but you can specify a different character encoding if you'd like. If you have a bytes object and you'd like to convert it into a string, you need to decode it by calling its decode method. Like the string encode method, the bytes decode method uses the character encoding UTF-8 by default, but if you have bytes that represent data in a different character encoding, you want to specify that character encoding. When you open a file in Python, whether for writing or for reading, it's considered a best practice to specify the character encoding that you're working with, because on different operating systems, Python will use a different character encoding by default when it's working with files. For example, on my machine, the default character encoding is UTF-8, but on a Windows machine, the default character encoding is usually CP1252. So if we read this UTF-8 file here, we actually get a Unicode decode error, which means there's a mismatch between the character encoding of the bytes that we're reading and the character encoding that Python's trying to use to read them. But you can't rely on Unicode decode errors always being raised when there's a character encoding mismatch. Sometimes the same bytes in one encoding will represent different text in a different encoding. For example, here we have CP1252 that we've used as our character encoding to decode some bytes that were encoded using UTF-8. This is actually a really common problem between UTF-8 and CP1252 in particular, because these two character encodings are very similar but far from the same. In Python, when you read a file, Python will read bytes from disk and then decode those bytes to make them into strings. And when you write to a file, Python will take your strings and encode those strings into bytes to write them to disk. It's considered a best practice to specify the character encoding that you're working with whenever you're reading or writing text from outside of your Python process, especially if you're working with non-ASCII text.